That's basically like the only positive of karma. It's like, okay, this person has this much karma, they're relevant, or they know what they're talking about, or they're okay.
It's for bot filtering.
Yeah.
So, speaking of shit talking online for love of the game and karma points and not money, welcome back to Idiot Seeking Village. Rich and Adam here, as always. Adam, I don't know if we actually introduced ourselves at the end of the last episode because we are frauds.
No, you did. We did.
Okay, excellent. Look at that. My memory doesn't exist anymore. That's just age and controlled substances.
Well, so many days have gone by since we last spoke.
It's been ages and ages, friend. So as I promised, part 2 of our episode here on concentration camps is going to focus on the good old U.S. of A. But before we, America. But before we dive in, I want to emphasize one thing. The U.S. has a long, complex history when it comes to immigration and detention. And I'm going to be leaving key things out of this story in order to focus on the most relevant parts relating to how we've used detention, camps, and incarceration specifically, and how that's evolved over time. So I don't think anyone should look at this as a complete history, not for anything we talk about really, but if I do miss something important, it's not because I'm a fraud. It's because I probably omitted it on purpose just to keep the story flowing and to keep this within a reasonable time frame.
Okay.
So you can call me out later when you find something and go, what the fuck? Why didn't you cover it?
That was a disclosure.
Yeah.
Can't sue.
Product not guaranteed to work or not intended to work. There you go. There's a general legal disclaimer for any product you ever consume or service. Product or service not intended to work. So starting in 1893, so this is right before the Spanish-American War and before the recontrasados that the Spanish used in Cuba, Congress passed legislation mandating the detention of any person not entitled to enter the United States. Typically, this consisted of convicted criminals, the mentally ill, or anyone not able to support themselves and likely to go on welfare or the dole. In practice, immigration officers had discretion and often released individuals on bond. Medical quarantine or legal detention would typically last only a few hours to a few days at most. And typically, these happened on Ellis Island. Mm-hmm. Ellis Island would be followed in 1910 by Angel Island Immigration Station in California, located in San Francisco Bay. Since most of its immigrants to the West Coast were Asian, Angel Island was in a lot of ways the opposite of Ellis Island because of racism and discrimination against Asian peoples migrating to the U.S. Their detention there, instead of hours or days at most, lasted weeks and months, and in some cases, years, because the goal of the facility was not processing and authorization. It was to delay, deter, and to deny entry. It was pure racism. Plain and simple.
So for the Ellis Island one, if like you came in here and you're like, oh, you can't be here, did they just put you on the next boat back? Is that what they did?
They turned you around. Yeah, next boat out.
Gotcha.
Right. So detention was typically very, very short term. Exactly. Yep. And typically, as I said, immigration officers had a lot of discretion. They typically would just put you on bond, right? This means you have to leave some sort of collateral and you have to promise to show back up if there was some sort of, case or question or anything like that. That was pretty standard practice. So then we get to World War I. Couple of actions. There's 2 passport acts in 1917 and 1918 and the Immigration Act of 1917. In tandem, these acts made entering the U.S. without a passport or other travel documentation illegal. The motivation behind the acts was wartime security concerns. The government wanted to be able to track the movement of people during the war, including to try and limit espionage activity. But they were also passed against the backdrop of growing anti-immigrant sentiment. The Immigration Act imposed literacy tests, expanded groups of people to be excluded. This was both practical, people with criminal records, but also race-related, such as the Asiatic barred zone that targeted Asians. The net effect of these acts was increased cost, time, and bureaucratic red tape in order to reduce immigration to the U.S. Even if someone met all the legal requirements to enter the country, they could end up on some undesirable list and be denied. So when you hear someone shout about how their grandparents or great-grandparents came to this country the right way, ask them when exactly they came here. Because if it was before these acts, they got through when essentially what we had was open borders, and you were far less likely to have been admitted right after this. Also in 1918, the U.S. government codified the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That's Title 50 of the U.S. Code. That's the same one that Trump invoked in March of this year with regards to Venezuelan immigrants, then blocked by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in September recently. I don't want to get off track too much, but the Alien Enemies Act and the codification of it gave the president broad powers during wartime and invasion to declare nationals of a hostile nation as alien enemies, detain, relocate, or deport them without normal due process, seize property, restrict movement and activity, specifically when there's a declared war or there's an invasion or predatory incursion by a foreign nation. In 1921 and 1924, the Emergency Quota Act and the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act passed respectively. They dramatically reduced immigration and established the quota system. For our discussion, it's enough to know that this fundamentally changed Ellis Island. Prior to these acts, it had minor holding facilities for legal and medical review, but its purpose was admission and processing, not detention. Starting in 1924, it shifted to being a detention and deportation center, while processing and admissions work was pushed onto overseas consulates. That is a critical change in how we're approaching this series of acts in the first quarter of the century. So we fast forward here. Next big thing, December 7th, 1941. Adam, do you want to give me your best FDR impression?
I'll say, a day that will live in infamy.
Hey, not bad, not bad. I like it. I think you could go for it. So we need to take out your legs, put you in a chair.
Please don't. It's the only thing I got working for me still. Barely, but still.
So, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, FDR issues a trio of proclamations invoking the Alien Enemies Act against Japanese, German, and Italian nationals in the U.S. Then in February of 1942, FDR issues Executive Order 9066, which called for the creation of exclusion zones and for the military to remove any and all persons from the zones for national security reasons. Executive Order 9066 did not mention nationality, immigration status, or race, but the War Department used it as an excuse to go after and detain some 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry in internment camps. At the same time, we rounded up some 11,500 Germans and almost 2,000 Italian citizens living in the U.S., along with some of their relatives and family that were U.S. citizens, under suspicion of espionage or Axis sympathy. Though those U.S. citizens were a minority, we housed these groups in camps across the country, primarily in Crystal City, Texas, Seagoville, Texas, and Fort Lincoln, North Dakota. I'm going to quote from the German-American Internee Coalition's website. In 1942, the U.S. government initiates exchanges of approximately 2,650 internees for Americans held in Germany. 6 exchange voyages carry many families to Germany, including American-born children and U.S. citizen spouses of German alien internees. As the war progresses, travel across the Atlantic is increasingly hazardous. Upon arrival in war-ravaged Germany, exchangees are unexpected and unwanted by their families. Many are suspected of being spies. Families with young children, some even born during the trip to Germany, have to make their own way to family homes through hazardous countryside, frequently in winter, carrying all their worldly belongings. Some men are beaten and arrested by the Gestapo as spies and put in camps, leaving families destitute again.
It's like it's the nowhere's home. You're a spy here, you're a spy there. What?
And again, it was some of these guys, again, German citizens, they're foreign nationals, but they had American spouses. They had American-born children, and we said, get the fuck out. All in a group. Yeah, it's pretty bad. So again, in 1942, we also took it a step further, starting a cooperative program where Latin American countries would capture German, Italian, and Japanese aliens living in their countries and send them to U.S.-based camps. This included German and Austrian Jews who had fled persecution. From a summary by the National Archives. Furthermore, on the basis of hemispheric security, the United States offered to intern allegedly dangerous enemy aliens living in Latin American countries and even recommended which enemy aliens should be interned. Over 15 Latin American countries accepted the offer and eventually deported a total of over 6,600 individuals of Japanese, German, and Italian ancestry, along with some of their families, to the U.S. for internment. Few, if any, of those deported received any sort of a hearing, so many did not know the specific reasons for their deportation. Often these individuals were deported based on hearsay or for other political reasons. So yeah, families, buddy. We love arresting families and people for just who they are.
We didn't end up sending them back to Germany, some of these people who would then later get executed. Did we?
I wasn't specifically mentioned, but given that we were shipping these people back on the boats back out east, we definitely did at least a handful of them, yeah.
But I didn't want to be killed. That's why I came here. Sending you back, dude.
Yeah. No. So not a pretty situation. So let's move past the war. Adam, did you ever fly into Las Vegas?
Yes.
A couple of years ago? Do you remember the name of the airport?
McCarran?
Yes, McCarran Airport is named for Pat McCarran, who was a 20-year senator for Nevada, and he was notorious for being one of Congress's most anti-Semitic and racist members.
Oh, yes.
Which is always fun when you learn about this shit. We really don't remember his name because, as far as I'm concerned, Strom Thurmond came along after him, saw his bigotry, and said, "Hold my beer."
And I bet he outlived him too, because I know Strom Thurmond was like what, 100 did he live to, or something close to it?
Oh, Thurmond lived forever. Yeah, I think he's still alive. I think he's still in Congress at this point.
Might as well be. They're almost, most of them are barely alive there.
For real. So, in 1950, the McCarran Act, or Internal Security Act, was passed, which included Emergency Detention Act, which authorized the Attorney General to detain persons suspected of espionage or sabotage during declared internal security emergencies. You want to know what it was nicknamed? The concentration camp law. Woo! America. By the way, does that sound familiar to anything Pam Bondi has done in the past few weeks? Yes, it fucking does. So, the idea behind the act was to produce lists of communists, anti-war activists, and civil rights militants, which Hoover's FBI eagerly did, and inter them in camps during a declared emergency. Truman vetoed the bill, but was overridden. 6 detention camps were constructed in Florence and Wickenburg, Arizona, Avon Park, Florida, Allenwood, Pennsylvania, El Reno, Oklahoma, and Tule Lake, California, and held on standby by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The camps were never activated, and the law was never revoked. In 1971, you want to guess who the hero of our story is? 1971?
Is it Nixon?
Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Yes, because Kennedy's dead already, so.
He signed the Non-Detention Act and formally repealed the Internal Security Act. But you know what? Fuck Nixon. The real heroes of the story are actually the Japanese Americans, those 120,000 who were interned under FDR's executive order. Many of them ran a grassroots campaign to repeal the act, and they were able to successfully gather support from a coalition of supporters by portraying themselves as loyal and innocent citizens who had been wronged by the state, and that because of this act, it could happen to others as well, again. So, good on the Japanese Americans who were interned for, honestly, taking the fucking high road and being awesome Americans.
And one of my favorite people was interned there, George Takei. Mr. Sulu himself was a child there.
I forget about that. Yes, that's right. He was a child in the camps. Oof. Good dude. Love him. So, this leads us to the granddaddy of today's events and framework for basically everything that comes afterwards. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. It's a doozy, and it set the basis for today's immigration framework, and subsequent acts have all largely been amendments to this initial document. Critically for us, the act and its modern successors authorized the detention of immigrants, but it says almost nothing about the conditions of that detention. In short, the act establishes the power to detain, but not how detention must be carried out. So when Congress wrote the act, they perceived immigration custody as an administrative function, not a punitive or carceral one. So they didn't think that standards for living conditions, requirements for medical care, food, safety, legal access, mechanisms for oversight and inspection, or a baseline level of adequate or humane treated needed to be established and codified into law. All of that has been since established through a patchwork of agency policy, executive directive, and court cases. For instance, civil detainees receive due process under the Fifth Amendment, but if they're denied it, they have to file suit to enforce it. Do you see what the problem is here? The gaping holes have been left between what someone has access to, what they are due legally, and what they are provided without any clear, consistent guidance. Mm-hmm. Also, that isn't why they're there. They're there for an immigration hearing. They're not there fishing for Supreme Court cases. So constitutionally, conditions cannot be punitive, arbitrary, or grossly inhumane. But there's no statute or mandate that says what it actually has to be as a result.
Right. And I'm assuming also there was no assumption that there'd be such a quantity of people that need to go through these mechanisms. And once they realized that, they just never decided to adapt to it.
Well, because everything had been temporary and just lasted hours or days up until this point. Yes, exactly. So a good example, and we're going to get into that. So a good example regarding the conditions is in 2019, when a Justice Department lawyer argued in front of the Ninth Circuit Court that the Trump administration was not obligated to provide soap, toothbrushes, or blankets to detain children as part of the obligations under the 1997 Flores Agreement, which is one of the court cases that helps as part of this patchwork, which sets standards for the care of migrant children for the now defunct Immigration and Naturalization Service. And since
borderline generosity is not something that's required.
Exactly. And since you and I exist in the peanut gallery and we are equal opportunity pooflingers, the same accusations of unsanitary and unsafe conditions were levied very much during the Obama administration as well. They just weren't as top of mind for a lot of reasons. So between 1954, after the passing of the act, and roughly 1980 or so, immigrant detention was rare. The feds adopted a policy of releasing migrants pending their immigration hearing, which was an option under the Immigration and Nationality Act. We had their info, they had a court date. Failure to show would make them illegals and subject to arrest and deportation. So they were incentivized to behave and to show up. So why should the government pay to feed and house them in the interim? It didn't make sense. It was costly and unnecessary.
Right.
So two things happened that culminated in wholesale changes to the government's approach on immigration and detention. The first was starting in 1972, a steady stream of Haitians, some 30 to 45,000 in total, for the next decade, fled the regime of Baby Doc Duvalier. They were mostly poor, single black men. Duvalier was an anti-communist ally that we didn't want to alienate. And so for a number of reasons, including straight up racism, state and local officials didn't want these migrants. The U.S. government classified them as economic migrants, not refugees, and refused them asylum. And they began to house them in temporary detention facilities to discourage these quote-unquote boat people from coming over. So that starts during Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Then in 1980, Fidel Castro, America's favorite dictator, opened the Mariel Port to allow dissidents to leave the island. This act resulted in some 125,000 Cubans fleeing between April and October of that year, in what's popularly known as the Mariel Boat Lift. The number of Haitian refugees also ballooned that year. The Carter administration paroled many of these Cuban migrants into the country and released them to family that were already here. The Haitians, however, mostly didn't have established family networks, and so the administration set them up in temporary camps at various military installations. So now for the first time, to your point you made just before, suddenly we've got volume, we've got numbers. Enter the Reagan administration. They were faced with fears of a continuing flood of Caribbean refugees. They were stuck with several thousand confirmed Cuban criminals whom Cuba refused to take back in an INS version of hot potato. There were issues with unrest and violence among detainees in these slapdash detention facilities, and there was fear at the time of an increased risk of AIDS coming into the country from these migrants. All of these factors, plus just plain old racism, combined to change policy, and we began detaining all arriving migrants, including asylum seekers. Migrants would now only be released after immigration officials found that they had met the legal definition of a refugee, a process that can take years. From a Washington Post article. According to administration officials, the detention policy was necessary to deter future immigration. Speaking before Congress, the Attorney General, William French Smith, stated that the country had lost control of its borders and would, without detention, crumble under the burden of overwhelming numbers. Reagan's Immigration Task Force, which was chaired by the Attorney General and his deputy, Rudy Giuliani, noted in a report that the detention policy could create an appearance of concentration camps filled largely by blacks. Still, the task force pushed forward with this approach. The detention policy began as an executive branch project. To enforce the detention mandate, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the predecessor to the current Department of Homeland Security, held migrants in a makeshift detention camp on Chrome Avenue in Dade County, Florida. There, migrants slept under threadbare blankets and ate spoiled food. The former Army barracks were infested with mosquitoes and snakes. End quote.
Snakes.
Yeah, well, Florida. I mean, at least it's not gators. So what the Reagan administration did there was they were actually following the letter of the law, according to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. The act said that arriving migrants without valid visas could be detained. In practice, though, for 30 years, immigration officials released them while the investigation was ongoing. Again, immigration is legally considered a civil matter, not a criminal one. Reagan took a hardline approach to try and give off the impression that we don't want you to come here in an attempt to stop or slow these immigration flows of so-called boat people into the U.S. In 1983, they passed the Mass Immigration Emergency Plan, requiring that 10,000 immigration detention beds be on call and ready for use. And then in 1985, Congress got on board with Reagan's approach, and Oakdale Federal Detention Center in Louisiana was born. It could hold up to 6,000 people in a dedicated, permanent immigration detention facility. This is also the period of time that private prisons first began to be a thing at the federal level. Corrections Corp of America, CCA, now CoreCivic, opened its first temporary facility in Houston, Texas on Super Bowl Sunday, 1984. They opened their first permanent facility in Houston later that year, and in 1985 opened a Laredo, Texas location to detain infants and children with quote-unquote the cribs right in the cells. Do you feel gross, Adam? Because I do.
I don't know what to feel anymore. It just seems like the same shit all day.
Do you feel... Well, the good news is I think you feel something. That's an improvement.
It's just like shit, different day, you know? That's just like par for the course that, like, we're supposedly a Christian nation. But God, do we not want any of those values, though? Or practice them?
Yeah, we don't really follow the teachings of the big boys in that book.
That's why it's like, how do you keep saying that? Oh, we're founded by a Christian nation, we're a Christian people, like, but you don't act like it. So you're really proving the point that we never were.
Yeah, good times. I'm going to continue from the Washington Post article. So, although members of Congress raised questions about empowering private companies that profited from detaining immigrants, a majority of lawmakers have continued to support the practice. In 2010, for example, Congress tied the Department of Homeland Security's funding to satisfying the immigration bed quota, or rather, detaining a minimum number of immigrants per day. That's the Obama administration, friend. Many of these members of Congress, scholars and advocates, point out, receive money from lobbyists and PACs that are affiliated with private prison companies. Today, over 70% of detained immigrants are held in privately run prisons. So that 70% number, that was quoted back in 2019. Data from the Marshall Project places the remaining detainees at that time as 10% in ICE-run facilities and 20% in county and local jails. Since then, according to data from a track report, for-profit immigration detention facilities still hold the vast majority of individuals detained by ICE. As of January 2025, private companies managed all 20 of the top 20 private detention centers. All told, 86% of ICE detainees were held in facilities run by for-profit entities.
Welcome to capitalism.
Yay, capitalism was my next line here. Yeah, exactly. We've basically found a way to not only criminalize this activity, but to make a buck off of it, or at least to have someone make a buck off of it at the expense of the taxpayer.
And their inhabitants.
Yes, exactly. So, sticking with the 80s and Reagan, at the same time, he renewed the war on drugs. We all remember that. And good old Nancy, the throat goat on TV, just saying, just say no.
The throat goat? Never heard that before.
What? Yeah, Nancy Reagan, the infamous throat goat.
What is that from?
That's just her nickname, man.
The throat goat?
Yeah.
I've never heard that term.
She was notorious for performing,
Really?
Yeah, dude.
Is that like a relation with like Sinatra type thing, or?
Not just him.
Wow. Now I'm definitely going to have to go on a little expedition after this.
Should we do an episode on Nancy Reagan, throat goat?
Because when you said that, I was like, that's such a sexual term. Like, I would be like, oh my God, that's so funny. I'm like, wait a minute. And then as you went into it, I'm like, he's really serious about this. This is not like some weird random shit about her. This is like a sexual prowess of her. This is holy crap.
I'm genuinely shocked you've never heard that before.
I am too, that this was such a thing.
I've
never even heard the term before.
I look forward to your search results and sharing them with me afterwards.
Absolutely.
So, 1988, the Reagan administration passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The effect here was that it added drug offenses to the list of criminal convictions under the Immigration and Nationality Act that would allow for deportation. And because of the overall tough on crime, tough on drugs atmosphere of the 80s, even minor drug offenses on people's records contributed to this act impacting the detention of migrants. So basically, even though this technically had nothing to do with immigration, it had a huge impact on immigration because suddenly the same reason we're incarcerating tons of Americans for extremely minor drug offenses, we're now using that as an excuse to incarcerate and detain migrants and asylum seekers and others because we don't want anyone with a drug record in the country, no matter how minor it is. And so what Reagan started, Clinton continued because fuck everyone, Republican, Democrat, they're all the same. In 1996, a new pair of laws was passed. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. I'm not going to read that acronym because it's awful. And the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. In short, these two acts combined to further blur the lines between civil and criminal law when it comes to immigration by expanding the list of deportable crimes, mandating detention and no possibility of release on bond for these crimes, and expanding federal and private detention facilities. In other words, Clinton took what Reagan started and made detention the central tool of immigration enforcement. The net effect of the laws were mandatory detention for large portions of non-citizens, the reduction of access to legal defense, and an increase in the use of the private prison system, setting the stage for an explosion in detention. The IIRIRA, hey, I did read out the acronym, and the AEDPA alone would have been enough to drive the number of detainees up. But 9/11 and the Patriot Act in 2001 added a subsequent focus on terrorist and national security threats, broadening authority for detention and directing money towards the upgrading and expansion of facilities. The key impact being an even further blurring of the lines between civil and criminal administration when it comes to non-citizens. In 2005, George W. Bush followed up with Operation Streamline, which ended what was called catch and release, effectively mandating pre-hearing detention for all apprehended non-Mexican migrants. Detention and holding between Reagan, Clinton, and Bush W. was now the default for America. So we spent 30 years not doing any detention, and then we spent basically the next 20 years making it the default and building it up.
So how many people are in these or had been in these facilities? Like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people?
Let's hold on to that for a
Okay.
moment. I've got those numbers at the end, but I think, we'll go back and look at this and the impact of each of these. Now, because behind every horror in this story is yet another bleaker horror, we finally get to the issue of detaining families and children. Woo! So, the first thing we need to talk about is the Flores settlement that I've mentioned a few times. The Flores settlement was a 1997 agreement stemming from an immigration case that started in the late 80s. Flores created specific protections for immigrant children in custody in the United States. Its provisions included the following requirements. Children should be released to a family member or another responsible adult as soon as possible. Conditions must be safe and sanitary. Children should be held in the least restrictive setting possible. Facilities must give children access to toilets and sinks, drinking water and food, medical assistance, if the minor needs emergency services, adequate temperature control, and ventilation. There must be adequate supervision to protect minors from others, and children must have contact with family members. That's the Flores Act. All seemingly pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So before 2006, before Operation Streamline and the end of catch and release, the Fed would separate families. Adults went to detention facilities and kids went to shelters or foster homes. Congress got wind of this, and they directed Homeland Security to keep families together in less prison-like, more domestic settings. What DHS came up with was this. CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, had this medium security prison, the T. Don Hutto Center in Taylor, Texas, that they had announced in 2004 that they were going to shut down because of lack of demand. Because of Congress's directive, ICE then contracted with Williamson County, where it was located, which then subcontracted out to CCA to operate the facility as a privately run family immigration detention center. Hutto was anything but domestic, and I'm going to quote from a report by the University of Texas School of Law's Immigration Clinic. The facility came under fire for the abysmal, punitive conditions inside. Prison conditions and practices prevailed. CoreCivic, CCA, which rebranded after a couple years later, forced all members of a family, including infants, to wear prison garb. Husbands and wives were detained separately and forbidden from visiting each other's cells. Detained families were forced to remain in their cells for as much as 12 hours a day and were subjected to regular counts. Children, who were provided with only an hour of schooling per day, were forbidden from keeping writing implements, toys, or stuffed animals in their cells. ICE and CoreCivic made no move to improve these conditions until litigation forced changes.
Little prison onesies.
We're getting there. 2007 lawsuit citing the same 1997 Flores agreement cited in the Trump-era lawsuit I mentioned earlier led to moderate improvements in conditions, but the facility was still under fire and new litigation loomed when in 2009 the Obama administration chose to convert Hutto into a woman-only detention facility. This left Berks, a small 100-bed facility about an hour outside of Philadelphia. The Berks County Residential Center got its start as somewhat of a pilot program in 2001, converting part of its youth residential facility into a family immigration detention site. The idea was to provide a humane alternative to jailing families in adult detention centers and was run by county staff, not ICE or private contractors. The idea was to provide housing for days or weeks, pending deportation or asylum hearings. The reality was families were detained for months and in some cases years. So with the closure of Hutto, Berks was the only remaining family facility until 2014, at which point shit started to hit the fan. According to Customs and Border Patrol data, some 68,000 unaccompanied minors were apprehended at the southwest border between October of 2013 and September of 2014. The Obama administration responded with emergency shelters on various military bases and ramping up family detention capacity. I'm going to quote from a write-up by Allegra Love, an immigration attorney who participated in the Rapid Legal Response Program to support these migrants at the federal facility at Artesia, New Mexico. At the time, that family detention strategy was President Obama's response to high numbers of Central American families fleeing violence in the Northern Triangle and arriving in the United States to seek asylum. The summer when I worked there, approximately 800 women and children were detained on any given night. It was a deportation mill. The plan was to send families from the border to a remote facility and quickly put them through deportation proceedings and send them back to their countries. The average age of the children inside was 6. The facility in Artesia only stayed open for 6 months or so while the Obama administration prepared 2 ICE detention facilities in South Texas as more permanent sites for family detention: the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley and the Karnes County Residential Center. Between those 2 facilities, both run by private corporations, there were over 3,000 beds for mothers and their children. It made me physically ill to be there. Just the sounds while you are there make a symphony of sadness. There is sniffling and whimpering and outright wailing happening at all times. It is the cry of hundreds of kids suffering in unison. The kids also all seem to be sick at the same time, so the sound of coughing and sniffling is an ever-present addition to the miserable chorus. And of course they were sick. They weren't eating and sleeping properly. I met kids who lost 30% of their body weight. I held them on my lap in court and felt their ribs. End quote. So yeah, Artesia, Berks, Karnes, Dilley were all rife with complaints about food, medical care, sexual assault, and others, as all of these camps have been since their creation. Representative Zoe Lofgren of California said the detention facility conditions were worse than Jordanian camps that she visited for Syrian refugees from that civil war. In addition, the long-term nature of the detention raised concerns about the inhumanity of housing children in a prison-like environment indefinitely. Obviously. In the spring of 2015, protests and hunger strikes at Karnes and Dilley brought the issues to the Obama administration's attention. In May of 2015, former Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid wrote, "Detaining mothers and their children who are fleeing extreme poverty, persecution, abuse, and violence is unacceptable and goes against our most fundamental values. There are many alternatives to detention that are humane, cost-efficient, and do not undermine children's mental health and our overall well-being."
I think it's fascinating that, this is a number of years ago, that at some point, it still made sense for them to flee their country, even though this was a high probability of occurrence. So how bad it would be.
That is the fundamental thing, right? And you've got to think, Trump is doing it now. Obama did it, though more low-key. Reagan very much did it. It was make this terrible as a deterrent. And these people are still choosing to come here in ever-increasing numbers because they go, I would rather deal with this shit show in the U.S. than what is happening back home. Right. Once again, instead of dealing with the root causes of problems, we are addressing the symptoms. Yeah. And we are addressing the symptoms in ways that cause more problems and cost more money and, frankly, eat away at our collective humanity.
Yep.
So, from a Marshall Project report, quote, in 2015, a federal court ordered ICE to release children with their mothers under an existing Department of Justice legal agreement called the Flores Settlement, requiring that kids be held in the least restrictive settings for no more than 20 days. Yet under that ruling, the government can still detain parents. The Trump administration said Thursday that it therefore had no option if separation was no longer politically or morally feasible, but to hold children in the same facilities. It filed a request to modify the Flores agreement so that family detention would not be subject to the 20-day rule or to licensing standards. Berks had already evaded the Flores settlement as it had a child care license. That certification was not renewed in 2016, but the county has appealed that decision, leaving the facility open and in limbo. Because of this, families often spend no more than 20 days in one of the Texas detention centers, but then are moved to Berks for indefinite periods of time. So all in, Karnes, Dilley, and Berks represent the largest family detention program in America since the Japanese internment. Which brings us, So this brings us to the start of Trump's first term, the zero tolerance policy and family separations. Zero tolerance called for prosecuting anyone who did not enter through a port of entry, with no exception for asylum seekers or those of children, right? So this is border runners, right? Mm-hmm. This meant the adults were now being detained in criminal facilities where children are not allowed. The children then fell under the auspices of the Flores settlement and could not be held in family detention for more than 20 days. And if at that point parents could not be released to them, they were then referred to the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement as unaccompanied minors. So starting in May of 2018, this zero tolerance policy and family separations ran for 50 days. And when it operated, some 2,500 children were separated from their families. In June of 2018, Trump signed an executive order to halt separations and house children with their parents instead. Now we had family detention. It's back. But now the Trump admin began to take aim at the Flores settlement status in court, aiming to change things, namely the 20-day limit on children being detained. So in December of 21, the Biden administration unofficially ended family detention, converting the Berks, Dilley, and Carnes facilities and using digital surveillance and remote tracking for families instead. In June of 24, ICE announced that Dilley would close. Enter Trump 2, Electric Boogaloo. In March of this year, Carnes once again received migrant parents of children for detention. ICE contracted once again with CoreCivic to reopen Dilley for family detention. In April, ICE started soliciting $45 billion in bids for new detention centers ahead of the anticipated passing of the One Big Beautiful Bill. The back of the napkin math here expands ICE's number of ready beds from 41,000 in 2024 to 116,000 by 2029. We're almost looking to triple the number of detention beds that we have.
It just is so mind-boggling. It seems mind-bogglingly unnecessary because we've spent so much money now and we're beefing up ICE's budget. Why aren't they, instead of going out on the streets with their guns and shit and grabbing people, just deal with the ones that you have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Get rid of those guys first and then go after the other ones. Go for the criminals that you said you were going to go for.
Well, that's the thing, right? Is what I just said, that zero tolerance policy and the other one, we've been progressively criminalizing more and more and more behavior of migrants and parts of their records to, again, immigration is a civil matter. It is not a criminal matter, but we have progressively criminalized so much of it that that line is extremely unclear anymore. It's supposed to be, immigration is supposed to be administrative, but we are actively militarizing and policing it in a way as if it's criminal in nature.
So my guess is the Trump Foundation or whoever he's working for and friends are major investors in this build out of detention centers, is my guess.
He's gotten huge contributions from CoreCivic, from Geo, like all these private prison companies. Yeah, huge backers. There's a reason this is happening. There's a reason we're tripling our capacity. It's not because we're trying to get a handle on immigration. It's because we want to funnel money to these companies and their Trump supporting owners. In March of this year, ICE was already at 120% of its on-paper capacity. Military bases are being used as temporary overflow until a number of new facilities are constructed and opening in multiple states. You and I and everyone has all heard of Alligator Alcatraz, but there's also Fort Bliss, Texas, which is the site of a 5,000-bed facility. The largest ever federal facility is being constructed. Camp East Montana is a 60-acre site in the Chihuahuan Desert in West Texas that's being proposed. Speedway Slammer in Indiana, a 1,000-bed expansion on an existing ICE facility. Cornhusker Clink, Nebraska, is a partnership with the state of Nebraska at the Work Ethic Camp in McCook, expanding ICE capacity with an additional 280 beds. And I just want to pause right there. We have not talked about fucking Nazis, other than to say we wouldn't be covering Nazis. But Work Ethic Camp? Are you fucking kidding me? Does it say Arbeit macht frei in letters over the entrance? Like, what the fuck? If you put that in a book or a movie or a TV show, it'd be considered hack work.
You know, what's interesting is that people should really think about this, is that you don't spend oodles of money building camps and beds for people that you're trying to get rid of, unless you plan on replacing them with other people in the future. You don't spend $1 billion on a building, and then if you're doing the job that you wanted to do, in 5 years that building is now useless. You don't do that unless you plan on filling that up with somebody else.
Very much a thought I had, Adam, as I was writing this is, there's a game of hot potato. You're spending tens of billions on these facilities. What are you going to do with them afterwards? Anyway, continuing. Another proposal for 6 separate sites in Colorado are under consideration for large-scale expansion. Camp 57, a dedicated detention facility within Louisiana's infamous Angola prison, the largest maximum security facility in the U.S., is also under consideration. Folkston, Georgia, is looking at an expansion to 4,000 beds. Miami Correctional in Indiana is looking at an Alligator Alcatraz-style remote facility. And of course, how can we forget Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, is back on the radar again. So ICE is now detaining, as of writing, migrants in over 600 facilities nationally, up from just 436 earlier this year. That's a lot. Yeah, it is a lot. So you had asked about numbers. So let's put this into context here. Detention has increased in leaps and bounds under successive administrations ever since Reagan. But what Trump is doing here in 2025 is the equivalent of snorting an 8-ball with a Celsius in either hand while riding down King Dakar at Six Flags. It is just supercharging it. Let's go through the number of detainees and the successive growth after each of the decisions we've covered today. The numbers I'm going to state here are the average number of people held in immigration detention on any given day in that month of that year. Okay. Or that year on average, right? So average daily detention. So this shouldn't be confused. If you sum these all up, you're going to get tens of millions of people, right? That's not how that works. Obviously, these people are there for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is. So you can't equate these directly, but this is how many people are held on any given day. These numbers are all sourced from data from the Center for Migration Studies, TRAC, and ICE's own statistics. From 1952 to the 1970s, an average of 30 people per day were held in detention. In 1979, a couple years into the Haitian boat rides, that number was fewer than 3,000 people per day. And it stayed that way until 1983, post-Mariel boat lift and post an increase of the Asian immigrants, when it increased to about 4,000 people on average per day. The 1988 Anti-Drug Act bumped that average to about 6,000 to 6,500 at any given time. In 1994, that number was still less than 6,800 per day. And then the pair of reforms that Clinton passed in 1996, that number jumped rapidly year over year. By the year 2000, we were hitting 20,000 people per day. So Clinton alone tripled that number with that pivot to detention first. That number stayed steady in the low 20,000s until the Bush administration, through the Bush administration, until 2007, when it jumped to some 30,000 people per day. And it stayed consistently in the low to mid 30,000 range throughout the Obama administration. So that is post Patriot Act, and that is post Operation Streamline and the end of the catch and release program. In Trump's first term, that number rose rapidly to an annual average of 50,000, and it peaked at 55,000 in August of 2019. COVID, like it did with everything else, put a huge dent to those numbers, and we bottomed out at just under 15,000 in early 2021. But under Biden, those numbers rose steadily, They were back to just under 40,000 per day as of January 2025. Since Trump's second administration started, detention activity has ramped up rapidly, jumping from that 40,000 number on Biden's exit to 50,000 daily average by April. And we hit 60,000 daily average in August of this year.
A lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and that is a rapid growth that is happening. Adam, I think we need to be crystal clear here. The United States is home to the world's largest immigrant detention system. These are the largest camps in the world, and we are aggressively making them even larger. Again, projected triple the capacity within the next 4 years. And even though this system legally is classified as civil and not criminal, the way these facilities are structured, operate, and staffed, they mimic criminal incarceration systems, and they hold detained individuals in prison-like conditions. They're held in secured facilities, they're wearing prison uniforms, and subjected to strict control of time and movement. They are exposed to the same deprivation and danger as they would in any historical concentration camp that we've talked about in these episodes.
Well, I mean, it would make sense. I mean, if you are grabbing somebody off the street and you have a gun, then you're going to put them somewhere where you have a gun still. You're not going to not do that. I just think it's like we keep doubling down on stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start compounding the mistakes, even the solution's going to be a mistake to some extent. But if you don't start somewhere, it's just going to get really out of control like it is now. But clearly the problem is the countries where these gangs and drugs that we want. They're not sending the drugs here because they like to send us drugs. It's because we want the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know how we don't go to some of these countries where they're fleeing and just say, you got to do something about these people or there's going to be consequences where we're going to have to start housing them in your country, in their homes. And if we have to do it militarily where you go bye-bye, then we will. And maybe the threat of that steps shit up. Because we seem to invade whenever we want to anywhere. So what's the difference?
You have to remember, though, the reason that the violence and the gang warfare is happening, yes, is one because of Western demand for the drugs that they push. But the other thing we've done is the School of the Americas was founded in the 50s, and we have made a point of every time there is a democratically elected government that we don't like or doesn't align with our business interests, we've gone in there and we've overthrown them. And we have destabilized that region over and over and over. And so these governments are unable, because of us, directly because of our actions, they are unable to control the gang violence and the criminality that's happening in their own countries. We have created this fucking problem because we couldn't have someone slightly to the left of Pat Buchanan be in charge of a fucking government in Central America because communism, right? And this is why this is happening. This is purely a problem of our own creation.
Right. So it's like, this is the outcome we want, but we're not willing to like put in the resources to ensure that this happens. So we're going to start the fire and then we're going to walk away. Because that's how we do it. All except for Germany and Japan. We went in there, we won, we stayed and put the government we wanted in there and made sure it blossomed, whatever you want to call it, into what we wanted it to be. Otherwise, we're like, oh, the Shah of Iran, he's all right. He's fine enough. Let's just keep him in power because he's doing what we want, but we're not going to do anything about the shit that he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you have a revolution and then nobody there is who you want.
Yeah, it's messy. It's messy. You know, this is where a lot of the isolationist conversation comes from, right? This is where a lot of America First comes from. But it ignores the fact that we created these problems and now we just want to walk away from them and we don't want to fix them, but we're dealing with the downstream results of them.
Yeah, they're at our doorstep now.
They're at our doorstep now. Yeah, and these things don't come out of a fucking void, right? These people could have perfectly well-functioning, safe countries, but we ensured that they don't because some fucking shareholders on State Street and Wall Street needed to make sure that they got their bag.
Mm-hmm.
And so we made sure that we now have this problem. as a result. It's, you know,
Yeah.
anti-government, right-wing conservative types always bitch and moan about the unintended consequence of government intervention, but they don't seem to care about that government intervention when it benefits their pockets, but then creates migrant crises.
Right.
They suddenly they're blind, deaf, and dumb to the consequences of that government intervention.
Yeah, so it's the government intervention and that affects them that they care about. It's like, well, who cares about anybody else? I'm getting paid. I get what I want. That's fine. The government can intervene all they want. But when they look like they're trying to take shit from me, then no, I can't deal with that.
Exactly. So, look, again, immigration is a civil matter. Here's part of the problem. Detainees are not guaranteed constitutional protections as they would be under criminal proceedings. They have a right to counsel, but not a court-appointed public defender when needed. It's on their own dime for their defense. They have fewer protections against indefinite detention. They have no rights to a trial by jury or a speedy trial. Again, civil case, not criminal. They have far fewer rights against self-incrimination, far fewer rights and protections against search and seizure, and fewer, more restrictive options for appeals, and a significantly lower burden of proof for conviction. In other words, these detainees exist in a world that you and I cannot imagine as citizens of this country. It is unfathomable to us, the way we've grown up and what we know about our rights. And yet, it's our country that is conducting these actions on a daily basis on an unprecedented scale. And it's a choice. As we've talked about, it is a choice. Things like remote monitoring and digital tracking options, they exist more so in 2025 than at any other time in history. And they are cheaper than incarceration, and they've been proven time and again to be 99% effective at ensuring migrants stay within the system and on the radar of immigration officials and show up to their court hearings. But for 40 years now, since Reagan, successive administrations have made a choice to build the equivalent of prisons for non-criminal legal procedures and to escalate over and over.
It's because the news, particularly the right-wing news, but sometimes the left, is that 1% is talked about 99% of the time. That
Yes.
are ones who don't show up, the ones who commit crimes. They're all criminals. They're all rapists. They're all the worst of the worst. 1 out of 100, if that much. You don't go out of your way to like criminalize all of them and make them animals.
You need one pretty blonde lady to be stabbed by a black person, and it's the only thing you'll ever see. That's it. That's the only thing. That exception is now the rule, and that is everything, and we have to treat all these people the same way.
Yeah. It's just funny when it's the other way around. It's like, oh, let's not mention that one. That doesn't work with our agenda. Just this one.
Yeah. When it's your own people, when it's your own groups, when it's ICE agents, when it's the police, when it's any of, federal, it's one bad apple. It's one, don't let it spoil the bushel. When it's one of the target groups, it's all of them. It's a blanket statement, and none of them deserve individual consideration. They're no longer human.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, dude, we didn't even get into CCOT. We didn't even get into some of these other things. I wanted to really stay this one in the U.S., but it's a problem, man. And I think writing this one out and kind of researching it, I get it to an extent. I get it, but it's a short-sighted response to a long-term problem that we have, and we're just continually putting Band-Aids on bullet holes when it comes to solutions to this long term. I think if we really want to, go ahead.
No, because it's like I said, we're doubling down on stupid. If you don't want 11 million illegal immigrants in your country, or whatever number it is now, and that is something like, this is the line, this is the number of people we want to get rid of here. All right, this country has survived with that fact for a long time. So address the problem and slowly deport them if you have to, and make it humane. You don't need to go capturing them on the streets. You don't need to wait for them at their appointments. They'll keep coming back until you need to address that. But you're going out of your way to make it look unnecessarily ugly and abusive.
Yeah, this is the kayfabe we talked about, right? It's all a fucking show. It's theater, for people to adopt a certain mindset. It's the same way that, and you've been pointing this out on our socials, Vance is out there constantly talking about left-wing violence. They just keep repeating the lie until it starts to fucking stick. And that is the game plan right now, right? Is militarize this process, build these detention centers. It's a necessity. It's for your protection, right? Mm-hmm. And of everyone involved. And, it triggers the fight or flight response in people. And they stop thinking and they stop going, well, if we actually wanted to fix this, we would support these governments in Latin and Central America. We'd ensure they're stable. We would stop fucking with their democratic processes, right? If we don't like who they vote in. And we would work with them in terms of trade. And we could build mutually beneficial economic systems that would actually grow our economy at the same time as stabilizing theirs. And you wouldn't have this push-pull mechanism of migrants fleeing violence and fleeing deprivation and economic uncertainty and gang warfare and all this other shit trying to come here. Because again, as horrible as this all is, as dehumanizing as it all is, it is better than what is happening in our home country, which again, we are in no small part responsible for.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, if I go to the United States, they're going to lock me up in a fucking room. They're going to give me a half-ass bed. They're going to barely feed me. I'm barely going to get a chance to shower. But at least I might not lose my head if I stay here, where somebody's going to probably cut my head off to prove a point. So it's like, it's a win.
Yeah, no.
And everyone loses.
Having a horrible system as a deterrent doesn't work because what's happening in their home country is even worse. Mm-hmm. And the only way that you can further deter it is to make it even worse on our end, right? And that's Jesus Christ, man. Like, how do you even do that legally? How do you counter gang violence and military instability? Right.
I don't know, but I'm sure this Trump administration is going to find a way. They seem gung ho on that. Because after this, there's like, it's Antifa. And after that, it's all these liberals are terrorists. And we'll figure out if they really are later.
Mm-hmm. Good times, buddy. How you feeling?
Not too bad. Not too bad. It's just so obvious, and like the issues at hand, and like all this is just unnecessary most of the time. But there's always a profit center somewhere, and everybody just always sold a bill of goods on some other bullshit. Like, these people, oh, they're terrible. They're taking our job. They're doing this. They're doing that. I'm like, oh, there's more to it than just that. And why do you think that's happening? It's just not happening in a vacuum.
Yeah, no, someone's getting paid as a result of this. I mean, we have Tom Homan, right? Homeland Security, right? Mm-hmm. We have him on hot mic. We have him on tape talking about taking $50,000 bribes, in anticipation of these ICE contracts and making sure that they get steered to people. Like, it is an open grift that is being engaged in at this point. We're not even hiding it anymore, right? So, yeah.
And the thing is so brutal. They are taking a fraction. It's like the Office Space thing of like just pennies. Every transaction will take pennies. These fucking douchebags are stealing pennies and taking your dollars to steal those pennies and torturing people in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always repetitive. It's always rhyming. They're always doing this. It's like, I made a few $1 million. You stole hundreds of $1 million to make those few $1 million, and all those people got fucked just so you can make those pennies. It's just such an abomination.
People's dignity, and it sells for so little. Right. People will sell out so much for basically nothing. And
so many people just keep eating it up. Keep eating it up. Eat up the bullshit. Eat up the bull. We're going to serve you shit. And thank you for giving us money to serve you shit. Because you're a sucker. And then everybody else becomes a sucker.
Exactly. All right, bud. think we
Fight
should
the power.
head off here. Fight the power, indeed. Yeah, fuck the man. Fuck the man, fight the power. Viva la revolution. And hail Antifa. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Stay safe out there. Hopefully you picked up a little something, some context that you didn't know about, and should help you frame some of your thoughts going forward.
Yes.
All right. Love
Peace.
y'all. Catch you later. Peace.
Idiot Seeking Village is a production of Village Idiots Media. For more, find us online at villageidiotsmedia.com or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and wherever you get podcasts.